One Nation's been the only consistent political party for the last 20 years.
They're not talking about you. All right, well, let me tell you, One Nation is talking about you.
Looks like the media's run away from One Nation. They're too scared to ask us any questions, mainly because we're straight talkers and we've got the answers.
This is like a call to arms. You guys need to start making the real decisions and who you're going to vote for.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the ExCandidates. My name is Stephen Tripp, and as always, I'm joined by Adam Zara. How you going, Adam?
I'm pretty good, Stephen. How you going?
I'm pretty good, thank you. And tonight we have Professor James Allan on. How are you tonight, Professor?
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me, Adam, Stephen.
Yes.
Thanks for your time, James. Really appreciate it.
Yes. No, we're very excited to have you on. You're the Garrick Professor of Law at Queensland University. You're also quite well known. You write for the Spectator. We both saw you speak at CPAC and also the Friedman Conference as well. So we thought we found you extremely interesting to listen to. So we thought we'd have you on just to hear.
You guys are sounding like my mom.
Well, we're just being honest, but one of the things that you were talking about at CPAC is you're giving your personal experiences of being working in a university and the way it is at the moment, you know, with a lot of conservatives kind of pushed out or silenced, and the left kind of have a stranglehold of the universities and the institutions more broadly. Can you just give us a little bit of an insight of what it's like on the ground in universities at the moment?
Sure. Well, I mean, we know in the U.S. when you give money to a political party, that's public information. So they can track university professors in the U.S. And so in law schools in the Ivy League, say the top American law schools, it's something like 9 or 10 to 1 Democrats to Republicans. In the non-Ivy Leagues, it's higher. And then there's whole parts of the university, think women's studies, think Aboriginal studies, sociology, big chunks of politics, or psychology, where you really don't see any conservatives at all, very few. Partly, this is not done overtly, it's done indirectly. If you have to get a grant to get promoted and you say are against stopping the boats, or you're in favor of stopping the boats, or in favor of traditional marriage, or pick any conservative position, you're not going to get a grant. You're just not. And then you have a whole bunch of things that, would make it almost impossible to get an administrative job. Now, I don't want to be a dean of law, but deans of law have to start every sort of meeting with an acknowledgement of country. I think they're condescending, they're patronizing, they're really an exercise in virtue signaling. Nobody takes them seriously in the sense that, you don't see these vice chancellors of universities with their 7-figure salaries. You don't see them, giving their home. They're not putting their money where they don't give their home to some Aboriginal person. Either you're living on stolen land or you're not. And so it's just it reminds me of the 39 articles. 120 years ago, if you went to Cambridge or Oxford, you had to purport to be an Anglican and subscribe to the 39 articles. Nobody took it too seriously as long as you were prepared to genuflect. It's a bit like that. Everyone mouths these words. When you actually listen to what they're saying, it's incredibly condescending to Aboriginal. I can't stand it, so I would never do that. So you would never get a job if you weren't prepared to do that as an administrator, right? You could refuse to stand up for the Australian national anthem, you'd still get a job.
Yeah,
you could still do it. There's almost nothing on the left that would foreclose you. But if you had sort of my set of views, you're just not getting a job in administration. Leave aside their horrible jobs. Australian universities look like a sort of mild version of East Germany. They're the most centralized, top-down, one-size-fits-all. This is what brings actually conservative academics and lefty academics together. We all hate the bureaucracy. Australia is insane with its bureaucracy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just with the whole idea, even when we were there for the Friedman Conference, they didn't even have an Australian flag flying in the hall. They had a transgender flag, the Torres Strait Islander flag, and the Indigenous flag, and the gay pride or the transgender pride flag. I mean, it's an Australian institution, and I don't understand how we can't. It's not making any sort of. We're not teaching our children or our students patriotism at all.
No, it's just an exercise in sort of virtue signaling and victim. We're sort of teaching kids to be victims, which is terrible. Look, there's parts of the university that are fine still, sort of engineering, math, medicine, sort of. But if you look at the evidence from the U.S., even those are starting to succumb to the sort of woke ideology, the whole bureaucracy around diversity and inclusion. They don't want diversity of outlook. And the kind of diversity you sign up to is it just creates an orthodox outlook. So people like me, I don't sign up to their diversity outlook. I don't agree that the science says that that there's that transgender men are women. Everyone with a scientific brain knows that's false. Every cell in your body either has XY or XX. Leave aside the 1 in a million who have XXY, right? And so this idea that somehow superficial operations and a lot of drugs somehow you can mimic it. And I don't really care what people do. Wait till people are 18; they can do whatever they want. I'm not sure I'd let the taxpayers pay for it, but if they want to do it, fine. But let's not pretend you're on the side of science. These people are not on the side of science. We saw that through lockdowns where they were wrong on just about everything, and they were thugs and they were despotic. And I went into the university every single day. There were a couple of us, but it was obvious if you read the data from early on that the lockdowns were a terrible idea. We're paying the price now. Scott Morrison was one of the worst prime ministers in Australia's history, in my view. And indeed, the whole Liberal Party was the kind of people who, they go and they get a job with the IPA. I love the IPA. It's a great organization, the Institute for Public Affairs. But they come out and they get pre-selected for the Libs and they talk a great game on liberty. Where was Smith and Patterson when it really mattered? They weren't there with Alex Antic, I'll tell you. They were a disgrace. And I say that explicitly. There was no commitment to freedom and no commitment to leaving people to make their own calls. Mandates, disgraceful. So, I think the Australian Spectator it's got a reputation around the world for having stood up against lockdowns and the vaccine mandates. We haven't really accomplished much. I think more people realize we were right. It's not like we've changed the world. No, I still see people with masks on and driving, and they're in the car by themselves. I'm not really sure what theory of virology they're working on, where you're in the car by yourself with a mask. I spent a couple of years during the lockdown just reading a lot of these studies. There's no evidence yet that masks work. There's no randomized control test that shows they work, and it's sort of a form of virtue signaling where you show you're part of the elect, and you're a good person by wearing a mask, but you're not. You're basically an idiot.
Yeah, I've had to make a few speeches in front of people as well, regarding the mandates, and especially recently, the last few weeks. And I say the same thing. I mean, I don't hold any contempt for people who wear masks, because I just believe that they've just fallen for the trick. They've just been tricked, and they've just been duped and scared.
Yeah, I mean, the press acted as a sort of mild version of Pravda. Even the Australian, they were the daily death counts. There's more people dying now than during the pandemic. Australia has a terrible, the one statistic you cannot game are excess deaths. It's hard to know how many people died with COVID versus because of COVID. But the one thing that no one can game is you look at how many Australians died, on average between 2015 and 2019, and that gives you a baseline. And then you see how we're doing. And you look at cumulative excess deaths. So that's deaths above what you would expect. You know which country has the lowest excess? It's Sweden. Anders Tegnell should get a Nobel Prize. They got everything right. And we have worse excess deaths than Sweden. When people like Morrison go out and say we handled COVID, well, we did not handle COVID. You cannot let people get away with that. Even on the one criterion they cared about, which is, deaths of old people, we're not doing as well as people who didn't lock down countries. And so when you start adding in other things, so many of these deaths are from suicide, from alcoholism, from missed cancer checks, kids' lives were ruined. It was the best 2 years ever to be a billionaire. I'm a small government, right of center guy, but during the pandemic, I almost felt like I should be a communist because we were taking money from the poor and giving it to the rich. We had asset inflation because we were printing money. People say, John Howard says Josh Frydenberg was a good treasurer. He was a terrible treasurer. They did everything to spend money like crazy. We are suffering right now a cost of lockdown sort of crisis in terms of the way our economy works. We spent like drunken sailors, except, drunken sailors spend their own money. Yeah. And these people are spending our money.
That's right.
So, I get mad when I think about it. We sent money from the poor to the rich. We sent money from the young to the old. People who missed 2 years of school, if you're not from a middle-class family and your mom stayed home every day and helped you at school, you're fine.
Yep.
But poor kids, they're screwed and they'll never catch up. And the evidence, even the New York Times is saying, was a terrible mistake to close the schools. And, Morrison is there making up out of thin air a national cabinet because he didn't have the cojones to make decisions. He didn't take the Section 92 challenge to keep the borders open. We were the only country in the world that wouldn't let its own citizens leave the country. This was just a disgrace. And so then you start to wonder, how is it possible for Dan Andrews to win this election in Victoria? Thug, despot. Well, because the Liberal opposition, they don't disagree with him on anything as far as they're going to have $2 public transport. Where are their attacks on this man? They don't seem to be in existence. How are you so incompetent that you can lose an election to Dan Andrews? I just don't know.
Well, we're the same. Like, I've been doing a bit of, little bit of looking and digging into it in between, when I get a spare chance. And when I watched the Peter Credlin report that she did, the Cult of Dan Andrews or whatever it was, the things that just on that report alone, which should make him not win. Peter Credlin's pretty.
I have disdain for the Liberal Party, and I'm a right of center guy, but the Victorian Liberal Party I have disdain for. But I still want them to beat Dan Andrews. Yeah. Dan Andrews is just how the voters can reward that man. But again, as you say, they were fed a steady stream of sort of ABC type news. Norman Swan, who hadn't practiced medicine 30 years, against him were the three people who wrote the Great Barrington Declaration. So Professor Sunetra Gupta at Oxford, probably the best epidemiologist in the world. She's got the chair of theoretical epidemiology. Jai Bhattacharya at Stanford and the Kuldorf guy at Harvard. And, these people have way more I'm not into credentialism, but they have way more credentials than some public health officer in Australia who came bottom of his or her medical class and has been in the public service for 30 years. I'm being a bit facetious, but effectively they all of a sudden found themselves, in the public spotlight and decided that, if you go to a football game and catch the football, you're at risk. No, you're not. Playing golf is a problem. No, it's not. These people were just making it up. Yep. These people had no clue what they were talking about. They based their claims on modeling that has been shown to be wrong by orders of magnitude. We should all be very angry about this. People lost their livelihoods, their businesses. Yep. They didn't get to see their parents die. I'm really mad about it, and I'm not going to get unmad about it. Let's put it this way: if someone apologizes and said I made a terrible mistake, we can move on. Yeah, I haven't heard that from very many people. Almost no one.
No.
Even the sort of supposed right-wing writers on the Australian newspaper who actually came out against the lockdowns. Well, Adam Creighton was great, the American correspondent, and Steve Watterson was fantastic. And that's it. That's it. And even on Sky TV, there was the Outsiders show, Rowan Dean, but the regular correspondents and reporters for Sky, they were just as bad as the ABC.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Alan Jones got Alan Jones got taken off Sky.
I need wine to liquidate my anger. Anyway, there you go. It's a nice Californian Chardonnay, buttery, healthy.
But what do you think happened? Because if we look at the COVID period, if you look at before the COVID period, you had Trump elected, you had Scott Morrison win supposedly the unwinnable election, you had Bolsonaro in Brazil, and then all of a sudden COVID hits, and it seems like every election since within Australia and New Zealand and other parts of the world, the left have got in. So what do you think happened?
You forgot Boris, who completely crumbled under the pressure of COVID.
Yeah.
Look, they didn't have the cojones to stand up to the sort of, I think everyone knows the public service leans left almost as much as the universities. And you're not, in a sense, you're getting advice that favors the left-wing views. So if you go back to October of 2019, the WHO had a pandemic plan that was based on 100 years of data going back to the Spanish flu and right after the First World War. And the Brits had a plan basically the same. It said never lock down, focus attention on the vulnerable, leave people to make their own decisions. Right. And so that's what Tegnell did in Sweden. He said, I just copied the plan that was now between November of 2019 and March, so 4 months. No new data came in. All they based their change on is what they saw in China, where they were welding people into their homes, and some scary footage from Italy. This is not science. They completely panicked. The public health cast, or clerisy, they came in and they're all for the sort of Neil Ferguson from Imperial College. This is a man whose modeling has been wrong going back decades. He was wrong about foot and mouth disease, caused all sorts of animals. He was wrong about bovine spongiform encephalopathy, mad cow disease. He was so wrong about that, by a factor of about 100 orders of magnitude. And so, they had these models, and most of the politicians didn't stand up to the scaremongering. Even Trump. Now, to be fair to Trump, Deborah Birx came in and she admits in her book she basically lied to him. She told him there's going to be people dying on the streets. Now, and Boris, he would still be prime minister if he followed the Swedish model. He'd look great. He sees himself as a latter-day Churchill, but he wasn't Churchill. He caved in completely. I know that he opened up faster than some countries, but it was too late by then. I mean, they spent like drunken sailors. So I think partly it was most people who go through journalism school get imbued with left-wing indoctrination, sort of oppression studies, and so the kind of people who come out in journal, they're not inquisitive, they're not curious, they didn't read the data, and the whole press became sort of part of a fear porn thing. You'd just be reporting the latest death numbers. There are more people dying now. We have a higher death rate now, and you're not seeing any death count on TV every day. It was crazy what they were doing. They weren't thinking, they weren't skeptical, and it was really, so they, as you say, Adam, they scared people. And people thought, they were going to die. They did studies in Britain during the worst of COVID, and people thought their chances of dying were 30% if they caught it. They now know, unvaccinated, if you're under 70, it was about the same as the flu, a little bit higher for some people. So the only people who had to worry were people who were morbidly obese or in their 75 plus. But the thing is, I don't think there's a country where I don't know that there's a country, the last time I looked there wasn't, where the average age of COVID deaths was lower than the life expectancy. So basically the people who were dying were already past the expected life expectancy. Now, nobody wants them to die, and we should focus protection on these people. But you're going to ruin the lives of the entire sort of country? This is crazy what they were doing. There was no cost-benefit analysis. There was no sensible looking at what's going on. It was a disgrace. It was the worst public policy. The former Supreme Court judge from the UK, Lord Sumption, he said it was the worst inroads on our civil liberties in 300 years. Clearly right. I get tired of all the sort of self-styled human rights people who tell us, that Australia is a terrible country the way we treat some, accused terrorists. They didn't say a word during the whole COVID. The entire Human Rights Commission, every single one of the commissioners, by the way, was appointed by the coalition. And not one of them said anything about overreach or thuggishness, or not a single word during the whole 2 years. These are coalition appointees. The right of center gets in, and they don't appoint conservatives to bodies. They appoint these sort of weak milquetoast barely center-right people. They couldn't even summon up the will to criticize Dan Andrews, which, of course, no Scott Morrison has yet to ever say a word criticizing Dan Andrews. So, the one good thing is that Scott Morrison lost. I'm glad he lost, and I'm glad they lost. They deserve to lose.
Yeah,
But who is the
and
hope?
maybe it's a bit of a wake-up call.
Yeah, but who is the hope of the side for you? If you can't look to Morrison, who is there?
Well, I quite like Peter Dutton, but apparently he's a hostage somewhere, filming a hostage video, or he has yet to escape and actually say anything on anything important. I have no idea what he's doing. I like him, but so far he hasn't. The Voice, bad idea. It's bad in principle. It's bad when you do cost-benefit analysis. You shouldn't have race-based items in your constitution. He hasn't said anything about that. It seems like he's playing a tactical game. He's going to wait till Labour comes out. Why did he make Julian Leeser the spokesperson, the opposition minister for Aboriginal Affairs, or even the Attorney General? The guy, Leeser, he's a nice person, but he was against repeal of the Section 18C hate speech laws. You make him Attorney General, and he's been a committed adherent to this Voice proposal. You make him. What are you thinking? And so I don't know what Dutton's doing. I mean, he's better than Morrison, and he's had cojones, and he helped take out Turnbull. That's good. But so far, he's barely said a word. Now, maybe it's a tactical, strategic decision, early days. There's nothing much you can do. I don't know. I like to think that's it. But,
kind of like
Canada's. I'm Canadian, native Canadian, haven't lived there since the late 80s. But the new opposition leader in Canada, Poilievre, great so far. The woman who's just become Premier of Alberta is fantastic. Poilievre, by the way, marched with the trucker protesters. Can you imagine a Liberal leader actually getting out there and protesting? No. And here's the new opposition leader saying what Trudeau did to the truckers was a disgrace. It was. The leader in Alberta, she's really good, Danielle Smith. So there's signs. Who can not like DeSantis?
Yeah.
He locked down for 2 weeks, realized he'd made a mistake. He had all the data. He argued with the reporters when they asked questions. He knew more than they did. He read all the studies, tremendous. And everything he did, he went from winning in 2018 by 30,000 votes. It was basically a 50% election, to winning 60% to 40% last week, 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
I mean, now part of that is they never closed the borders and the internal borders in any other country. So a lot of Americans who were in Michigan or New York, they just moved to Florida.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons he won by so much is there's been a movement within the U.S. and people who don't like lockdowns have just moved to Florida. But he also won a lot of people who realized he got it right. And so he's the hope for the side. These things always go in waves, but the problem right now is not the center left-wing parties. The problem is our side of politics. We're getting careerists. They go to university. They become sort of politicians at university for the University Liberal Party. They become, Matt Keane type liberal lefties, and then they win all the pre-selections. We are not pre-selecting people. I would not pre-select anyone who hasn't had a real job for at least 10 years. So all these people are doing the pre-select. Stop pre-selecting people who are ministerial aides. Stop pre-selecting people who work at think tanks. Like zero. Even if they walk on water, don't pre-select them until they've had a real job.
Exactly
Because,
right.
They're pre-selecting useless people, if I can put it that way.
Well, that's right, because those kind of people have basically, as you said, gone from school into a sweet job that they don't have to chase the dollar. They don't have to really worry about anything. They don't have to, like in my instance, personally, I've had to. I went through the ranks. I became a tradesman. I went to factory work. I've done office work, and then I've gone through to start my own business. And then what happens is I've had to chase work. I have to. I know what it's like not to be able to put food on the table. I know what it's like when electricity prices go up. I know what it's like every 3 months when the gas bill and electricity bill comes in, and if there's a $100 rise, sometimes that's a matter of like, well, now I'm going to go work Saturday and Sunday to make sure that one gets paid on time. So if they haven't had any experience like that, I find, as you're saying, that, you know, they're losing touch with the people. And when they keep pre-selecting people like that in, the disparity gets bigger and bigger and bigger, I believe.
I think you're right. And they need to fire all the political advisors. They're all risk averse. You know, the evidence from around the Anglosphere is that the inner city seats are gone. People think that rich people vote right. That was true 50 years ago, 40 years ago. Wealthy people now vote left. The 100 wealthiest counties in the U.S. in 2016 all voted for Hillary Clinton. You know, so the left-wing parties are sort of today a coalition of the sort of human rights barrister type people. They're super wealthy, the wealthy, and the very poor and on welfare. That's your left-wing coalition. The right now represents the working class. And, you know, people who've gone to university or the university, they vote left. And it's a bigger group of people. We've seen this in Britain in the 2019 election. But that you're going to set your policies for the inner city sort of wokesters. You know, Morrison lost the last election simply by signing up to net zero. Yeah. He couldn't differentiate himself. Even John Howard has become a bit soft and left, in my view, since he left office. But even John Howard said, this is crazy. So they had, you know, you're not going to win an election when you say they're going to get to net zero in 2030, but we're going to wait till 2031 and a half. I'm being facetious. That's not a winning argument. You've sold the core foundation, and so these people we need to get politicians who have a bit of a background. They're out there. I like Antic a lot. Matt Canavan is fantastic. He can't even get into cabinet because he doesn't want to subscribe to the orthodox, sort of woke orthodoxies of Little Proud. You know, I'd get rid of Little Proud. I know that Canavan's in the Senate, but, you know, get him a safe seat, put him in the lower house, make him leader of the Nats. You know, we'd all be voting Nats if he were leader. It's right. A weird thing. I got here in 2005, and the politician I probably have the most. I was going to say, so 2005. I mean, I find that there's almost no liberal politicians I have much in common with. It's really sad.
Yeah, I do like Senator Alex Antich. I think that Liberals should. I think he should work his way towards the top quicker than maybe he should, because you know, that would. I like the way that he talks, and I like the way he stands, and I like that he has actually the backbone to kind of stand against, you know, the leftist ideologies. Even just going up in a recent article where what do you call it? Crossdresser was reading a book, The Girl's Famous Suit or something like that, on the ABC to children, and then he called him out on that, and then he's copped a lot of flack, you know, saying transphobic and whatnot. And
well, they cop a lot of flack in Twitter, but, you know, they've done studies in the U.S. About 5% of people post regularly on Twitter, and those kind of people, when they look at their views, equate to the most left wing of the 435 House districts in the entire U.S. So, you know, Twitter is not a representation of views. We have to stop catering to the views in Twitter. Just ignore them. Yes. I was going to say the sort of the politician I find I have the most in common with, which is incredible, is Mark Latham. On most things, Mark Latham. I mean, I don't want to be in the game of criticizing people, but I think if One Nation had him as their national leader, they'd jump about 5 points in the polls. Not that Pauline Hanson isn't good, she is, but as a national politician, she's just not in the same league as Mark Latham. And Mark Latham I think he'd see One Nation jump to 10 points in the polls anyway, and basically make it almost impossible for the Libs to win an election without, you know, moving a bit to the right. That's my view. Could be wrong, but I really like him. Most of his views are good. I wish he'd leave New South Wales and go national.
Well, he's not allowed to leave New South Wales until he passes all his information on to myself, because Mark's actually taken, well, I like to say he's taken me under his wing just a little bit. He's showing me the ropes. He's trying to give me as much help and as information as I can, so I can be the best politician I can be. I'm also a centre-right. I'm conservative. I believe in little government, and you know, and I just want to try and learn from who I believe is one of the best politicians as well. To try and, you know, because what happens is somebody's got to take the torch. Everyone, all our, you know, he's a great politician. He's, you know, pretty healthy and fit, but you know, like he's not going to be around forever in the political game. And who's going to take the lead? Who's going to take the torch? Some of us newbies have to come through and learn from some of these old amazing politicians who actually stand by what they believe in. And that's
I will tell Mark you called them old.
Oh, don't do that.
Don't you worry about that, Adam.
Well, I didn't. I said he's young.
He's sending an email later tonight.
Well, I'll try and send him an email quicker than you, so that I'll get you my side of the story first. But you did bring up a really good point about.
I believe I heard old and decrepit, but maybe I'm imagining the decrepit bit.
Oh, I said he's fit and healthy, but you know he's getting older, and he's not going to be in the political realm forever. That's what I was saying. So you can quote me on that one. But you brought up a really good point a few minutes ago regarding hate speech, and I did doing my little bit of research to ask you some decent questions. You know, so I know that you're really disappointed in the Liberal government allowing the hate speech 18A or C go through.
C
18C.
They didn't allow it to go through. They tried to repeal it, but half the party room was against repealing it. So this is basically a license to outlaw being offended. No one has a right to be not to be offended. Part of the give and take of democratic life is you have to put up with people who don't agree with you. And if they say things that offend you, well, reply to them and suck it up. And this is, you don't get to be a delicate wallflower. Well, you do.
Now you do.
You do. And, that Bolt case was pathetic. Bolt was just pointing out that when you're in the game of having affirmative action benefits, a hell of a lot of them for Aboriginals are going to people who look to be 128th Aboriginal. And do we really want to be giving out benefits to people where 7 of their great-great-grandparents were oppressing the 8th? This is crazy, right? Yeah. So I don't like affirmative action for anybody, but if we're going to have affirmative action, you think it would be targeted at people who actually have some sort of lineal descent, not sort of some barely noticeable lineal descent. And just even saying that, the judge said he didn't like Bolt's tone. Well, who cares what the judge thinks about somebody's tone? Since when does tone matter? You ought to be able to be bitingly sarcastic. And the fact that the Liberal Party room, and this was a bad problem by Abbott. I think he was advised badly. I don't know if it was Peter Credlin, but it would have been better for him to put repeal to the, force it through the party room and make the Senate vote it down. He lost a lot of support for caving in on 18C repeal. And I don't know that he'd do it again. And, George Brandis was terrible at his appointments to the courts and everywhere else. But Brandis is right. If you're going to have protections for free speech, it includes everyone, even bigots. Nobody likes bigots, but your response to a bigot is to say why they're wrong.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King didn't say we should silence bigots. He said we should show they're morons, and I'm all for that. Mm. So the lack of vigor and commitment to principle in the center-right parties is just so on display, and we saw it all through the pandemic again. They had no core values. It doesn't, even if you thought that this disease was slightly worse than the flu or 3 times worse than the flu, and we knew from the Diamond Princess it was never going to look like the Spanish flu. But even if you thought that, you still have a commitment to liberty and to freedom and to leaving people to make their own calls. Well, that apparently is not true. And so part of me wants to see some of these people, sued into bankruptcy or something because they were just shockingly bad. And I don't know if it's hard to see who the next leader is going to be who's got a link to this sort of tainted response to these things. Maybe I'm wrong. An apology would help. As I said, we haven't seen any apologies.
Well, I can't.
People are still pretending that they made the calls that were right. And, as you read the data pour in, they just didn't. They made all the wrong calls.
And they're doubling down again. Even in Queensland yourself, you're in amber. You're in amber.
I'm not wearing a mask, so they can put me in jail.
Well, that, I've already said that
You
too.
have to
So
draw that line.
I've
There's
said it
no
too. I've
evidence
said
of
it.
masks. When you look at the studies that show masks do anything, they're mannequin studies where they take a mannequin, put a mask, and they spray liquid at it. Well, of course, masks stop liquid, but most of the pandemic, it's an aerosol. I was on a panel with Jay Bhattacharya in Melbourne a while back. Great man. Came out to Australia basically just for the flights. He didn't ask for any money. Gave some great talks. And, he said there's no evidence that masks do anything. Now, if someone's going to argue with that, realize you're arguing with one of the 10 best epidemiologists in the world. Let's have some evidence. What are you pointing to?
Well,
When you ask people that, they point to non-randomized control tests. They point to mannequin studies. Even if you just look at how different counties did in the U.S. or how different states did. Florida did it as well as California. Florida unmasked, up to you. California sort of mimicking Dan Andrews, more or less, and they'd had no better outcome. So what's going on here? Anyway, I'm getting worked up about the lockdowns and the vaccine mandates. A lot of people had their lives ruined, and I have a lot of sympathy for those people.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's also another effect as well, because what happened was, like, I know in my career, in my business, we had actually, because it falls under personal health, security, and safety, we were able to continue to work. So what happened was it kind of changed the flow of the year that we've had I've been in the trade for 15 years. And, what happens is it ramps up at Christmas time, then drops off after Christmas, and then it plateaus out up until tax time. After tax time, or just before tax time, people start buying. So you build your structure and your business and kind of over that. So you kind of make your money at Christmas time. And then what happens is and then it gets you through until it picks up again in August when we have our first 30-degree day. What happened was now it threw that whole cycle out of sync. And what we're finding now is that actually, like, my business now is going to struggle for the next year because everyone's already spent their money on doing their products and stuff like that. And it's okay because I'm conservative, I've saved and I'll get through it and there's no dramas like that. But a lot of businesses, same thing, they spend and kind of spend. Yeah. And what happens is so I think that you're going to see a side effect of the pandemic over the last 2.5 years, not just in the students at school who are already behind in New South Wales by 5 years to their peers overseas. But we're going to find out.
Even before the pandemic, we were down there with Kazakhstan. Now I figure we're battling it out with Sierra Leone for, bottom spot in the. We have terrible education results. Yeah. And there's some evidence now that the students who actually had their parents teaching them for 2 years are no worse off than the students before the pandemic. That's how bad our education system is, and we made it worse. Almost impossible.
I agree.
And what we do is we tend to throw money at it. People don't realize that the evidence is up to when you really spend very little, money actually has some correlative effect. But once you get to a certain level, more money does not correlate with better results. What you need is teachers who stand at the front of the class and expect you people to listen.
Yes.
You need old-fashioned sort of teaching style. So none of this whole language garbage. You want to go with phonetics. Phonics, phonetics, whatever you call it, where you sound out words. And so, over the first 3 months, those kids are a little behind whole language because the kids memorize 100 words pretty quickly and they look like they can read, but then they run out of gas. And the kids who learn how to sound out words, once they get the hang of it, they catch up very quickly and then they just shoot past.
And keep going because they can learn the rules.
Because they have some tools for sounding out words. English is tough. Yeah, so there's some things you do have to memorize, like through, though, tough. The OUGH is just random. Yeah. But the English curriculum in this country is appalling. So there's a lot of problems, but we made it worse during the pandemic. I totally agree with that.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Adam, I forget did you say your business was razors and shaving? I forget what you said it was.
Yeah.
Steve told me it was something like that. I can't remember.
I did have Stanley knives, but what happened was, I went bald and I still needed to be able to run my fingers through my hair. I'm not lucky enough to have head of hairs like you guys, you know what I mean? So I had to grow it elsewhere.
Well, it's not supposed to be you running your fingers through your hair. That's supposed to be your wife. But
okay. Well, after the pandemic, she has to see now. She has to work in the private. She's not even around anymore because she always has to work away now because she found a job where she was a registered nurse and she lost her job through the mandates, and now 3 days a week she's not at home. So I don't even get that anymore.
So where is she now?
Well, she works in the private sector as a home carer.
Right.
And she lives in people's homes. And then when she's not doing that,
and Steve, you're in Sydney, or are you northern New South Wales? I forgot.
No, I'm in Sydney. We're both in Sydney, yeah. So I'm in the Northern Beaches, and Adam is out west in Campbelltown area.
Campbelltown.
I lost my job during the pandemic, so we all experienced it in different ways, and it was a crazy time. And people think that we can just move on to other things, and some of us have kind of been left behind, going, "Hang on a second, like."
Have you managed to snag another job?
Yeah, no, I've. You slowly claw your way back, and I'm back in a pretty decent position now, so I'm happy with that. But going back a year ago, it was quite traumatic. You're faced with the prospect of not being able to pay your mortgage. I only had a 2-month-old daughter. Waking up every morning.
Brutal.
Yeah, it was
brutal.
brutal.
And meanwhile, the people who made every lockdown decision, they bore none of the costs. Nassim Taleb says you only trust people who have skin in the game. They had no skin in the game. They didn't suffer any of the consequences. They were making great decisions. They didn't have to pay any of the costs. If you had a system where all of the public service and all of the politicians lost a third of their income while the lockdowns were in place, they wouldn't have been in place for very long.
No, definitely not.
And so this idea that people who pay none of the costs, like the entire public health clerisy, they bore none of the costs. And if they started bearing the cost, and they sort of had a hard time with their mortgages, and they had a hard time paying their school fees, whatever, they would have been a little bit more open to arguments that this is a bad idea. Again, everybody knew this before the pandemic. One of the things that surprised me was how sheep-like Australians were. I bought a shirt from the US that shows sort of apes evolving into humans and then into sheep, because I don't know what happened to Australians. I think Clive James was right. He joked at one point before he died that Australians think they've descended from convicts, but no, they've descended from jail wardens, and I think that's right. I mean, the Australians were some of the most compliant, obedient people on the planet, and this just shocked me. The idea that Australians were sort of larrikins turns out to be completely false.
Yeah, I mean, how did we go from World War One?
Sheep-like, pathetic, and the more you are worth, the higher your net value, the more sheep-like you were.
Yeah.
So this sort of challenges. Yeah, this challenges some of my right of center, pro-market, small government views, because the kind of people who've done well, they really just bug me the way they were so pathetically sheep-like.
Yeah, I know. It was. I was going to say, how do we go from World War II, where we were notorious for being larrikins and not taking orders? We weren't taking the British orders. We kind of fight our own battles. That's a lot of culture was built on that.
Even in Britain, you've got people who withstood the Blitz.
Yeah,
and, Spitfire pilots had a life expectancy of 2 weeks during the battle, and COVID barely changed your life expectancy at all unless you were obese or over 80. And people were pretending. We went back to North America and Britain both Christmases. We had to apply to get out. I mean, really, this was not bravery on our part. This was just reading the data, and this overreach by bureaucrats. Really annoying. Really, really annoying.
Well,
what I think the Australian
larrikinism. Sorry, Stephen, with this Australian larrikinism and all that kind of stuff, and our kick-ass kind of attitude. I mean, you see people flying the sticker of Ned Kelly and such is life. And I'm from Campbell. I'm from the heartland, And like Ned Kelly was, he was a bandit. He was a bush ranger. He stood against the law, and people idolize this guy. And he's like he's a hero. He's a folklore hero of Australia. even though he was probably a criminal. But what I'm saying is, like,
another thing that, I grew up in a sort of lower middle class family in Toronto. I was probably the most pro-police law professor in the country. But pandemic really changed my view of the police. I always stood up for the police. They have a hard job, but the way they behaved, and it wasn't really their fault as much as the politicians and the senior police officers, but they were thugs.
Yeah.
Just watch some of the clips from Victoria or New South Wales. Some of the things these police officers did, they should be ashamed of themselves. And so, I've sort of changed my mind. These police officers, not all of them, as a minority, but you've all seen the clips of them throwing people to the ground and handcuffing pregnant women. Anybody who handcuffs a pregnant woman, just you should be ashamed to look at yourself in the mirror. Yeah. So it was pathetic, and so it's really now this was mostly Victoria, but also in other states, not just here in this country, Britain, Canada. It was a little better in some U.S. states. One of the great things of being on this show is, if I call out and ask my wife for another glass of wine, I have zero chance normally. But being on this podcast, I have a bit of a chance. So I'm going to test this theory.
Go and do it.
Heather, can you bring me a glass of wine, please? This might work.
Is it going to
never normally work.
Is it going to happen? Lucky no lefties watch this show.
We'll see. I've called. We've got friends in the back. They're already drinking. So.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Sunday night.
Thank you.
You're a professor.
For giving us your time.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We're probably.
Well, hang on. I want to see if this works, because
it's going to work.
There's zero chance it'll work.
But we had probably 100 law questions.
Look at this, guys. Come here. Onto the screen.
Success.
Ta-da!
Hey! All right.
I said, there's no chance you'd ever bring me a glass of wine if I weren't on the podcast. You see? The virtues of the podcast. That was amazing.
Yeah. But we as you're a professor of law, we have a whole bunch of questions we want to ask you. We're running a bit low on time, so I'm going to give you the choice. We're going to ask you one about Glenn Jury down in Victoria and what your views on that was. If you've seen the interview that's come out recently when he was speaking to one of the freedom parties, and the other thing is a Bill of Rights and whether we should have it in Australia. So you get to choose which one you want to talk about. Whether we talk about the Bill of Rights.
Glenn Jury's he's the preference whisperer, isn't he?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Well, small parties have to be careful. You can't trust these guys. I mean, he's done good stuff in the. He got suckered, really. What can you say? Probably not going to play out very well. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I don't really like proportional voting systems. So the problem with the Bill of Rights is this: people all on the right side of politics. I'm against bills of rights. They read them and they think, oh, right to free speech. I'll be able to say anything. They imagine it's some sort of absolute. But there's all sorts of limits on free speech. The most constitutional protections on speech in the world is the U.S. You can say way more on an Australian university campus than you can in the U.S. There's all sorts of limits. So when you buy a Bill of Rights, you're effectively buying the views of the judges. Now, you might not like unelected politicians, but let me tell you, you got a better chance of getting a sort of halfway decent compromise than you do from the judges. The entire legal profession is noticeably to the left of the median voter. And so what a Bill of Rights does is it sells a certain set of entitlements in the language of rights. So everyone gets this free song of excitement down their spine, right to free speech, right to freedom of religion. And they think, oh, I can say anything, or I can do anything in the name of my religion. But there's all sorts of limits. The problem is that the limits are applied by the judiciary. The judiciary decides where your limits on speech are. And their views are way to the left of the median voter. You buy a Bill of Rights, you buy the views of the judges. So we don't have a Bill of Rights in this country, but we have this implied freedom of political communication that the judges have made up out of thin air back in the early 90s. And from that first case, the ACTV case, you can strike down legislation if it, seems to be a limit on speech related to elections. There have been 5 times when the judges have done it. Every single time it's been Liberal Party legislation, right? They never have struck down labor legislation since that original case, which was labor legislation. So I told members of the Liberal Democrats that they would not win the case that went to the High Court on the name of the party. You know, so the problem with the Bill of Rights is you imagine that you've got these sort of omniscient beings, but Bill of Rights is effectively selling you moral entitlements in very vague amorphous terms. And when you bring it down to the sort of quagmire of day-to-day decision making, it's real life people who have to make the calls. And either the calls are made by the elected legislature where you have some input and they have some accountability, or the calls, as in the US, as in Canada, as in Britain, are made by unelected judges. Now, maybe if you have a federalist society, and maybe if you have a President Trump appointing your judges, you have some hope of getting half-decent outcomes. But, if you look at that Love decision where they just made up this differential treatment for, people claiming Aboriginal descent not to be deported, the judges in the majority, it was a 4-3 case, 3 out of the 4 judges were appointed by George Brandis. The Liberal Party appointees to the High Court of Australia are probably worse than the Labor appointees. Right. Anyone who goes down the path of a Bill of Rights just doesn't understand how the world works. I am completely against bills of rights. I understand that, if you imagine that you're going to just transplant Gorsuch over from the US, but you're not going to get that. You're not going to get a late 18th century Bill of Rights. You're going to get a post-World War II Bill of Rights. They're going to be doing all of this proportionality analysis. You're going to have, people who have been educated in the milieu of woke lefty law school. And why you would want those people to be making the sort of social policy making calls, debatable calls, is beyond me. Keep them out of it as much as possible, is my view, and let the elected, at least where you have some recourse. And so I don't know. I've never been in. I've debated on bills. People who think that a Bill of Rights is good just don't know. And this is a word from the philosophy of science. They don't know the facts, if I can put it in those terms. So this is a bad thing, and there's no obvious way to make it better. You cannot translate the American Bill of Rights. And forget that. If Hillary Clinton had won the election in 2016, she would have appointed judges. You'd have a very different set of First Amendment jurisprudence.
Yeah.
Ultimately, you are hostage to the kind of judges who bring these bizarre interpretive approaches where, basically it looks like they're making it up at the point of application. So I would recommend to people to run at the first sound of a Bill of Rights. Terrible idea.
So what you're saying, just in lay terms, is basically it would be a Bill of Rights to today's climate, not like what they have in America.
What I'm saying is bills of rights don't interpret themselves. They are sort of ambit claims where there's all sorts of built-in limits, so you don't know what they're going to be. And the people doing the limiting are real-life judges from today. Yeah. Judges who are chosen by the Labor Party or by, the left wing of the Liberal Party, the sort of George Brandises of the world. And if you think they're going to deliver the results you want, you're deluding yourself.
Yeah.
It's better to leave the calls with the politicians, however flawed they are. At least you can bring political pressure to bear and they're accountable. So
and
I have
kick him
no
out after
time
3 years.
Sorry?
And kick him out after 3 years if they don't do what you want them to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, wow.
I want to see you guys call your wives and get you to bring them some.
My wife's not even at home.
Oh, sure. Cheap answer. I mean, I feel like I've delivered on this front. Where are you guys?
I get my wife to bring me stuff before the podcast.
Oh, yeah. Talk is cheap.
Don't prepare. See, we do this every week.
No evidence for that. No evidence.
I promise. Next time I do a podcast, right? Not tonight because obviously my wife's not home, but I will make a point to call her and bring her something. So if you do see it, you'll see me do it. I'll make good on that promise.
Let's hope that's true.
Yeah, awesome.
Oh, Professor Allan, thank you very much for coming on. We could talk to you all night. Unfortunately, we can't tonight, but we'd love to have you on again in the future because you just seem to be across so many issues and you have such a good opinion that I tend to agree with a lot of the time. I don't know about Adam, but he probably does as well. So thank you very, very much for coming on. How can people follow your work?
Well, I don't really do social media, but I write for the Spectator Australia, which is, a great magazine. And if you support it, you're supporting the one publication in the world that stood up against lockdowns from day one. Ramesh Thakur, Rebecca Weiser, me. So that's good. Occasionally I'm in the Australian law and liberty in the U.S., conservative woman. So I write from all sorts of things, but you know, I think people should sign up to the Daily Skeptic coming out of Britain. It's a great. They get about 1 million people every. You know, they send something out every day. That's Toby Young, free. You know, they ask you to donate. There's some great publications out there. But again, thank you guys. I've really enjoyed being on the show, and it's nice to have people, you know, compliment me the way my mom does. So you don't get that very often. I normally speak and people hate me, so I'm more at home where people hate me.
Well, thank you very much for your time. We love. Well, I've enjoyed listening to you speak every time I've heard you speak, and I've been watching some of your videos now that are on YouTube and things like that. So it's been a great pleasure actually to have you on. So I do thank you very much.
Well, thanks, guys, and I'm now heading out to deal with my friends and have some more drinks. So, bonsoir.
Bonsoir.
Okay.
See you, mate.
Good night.
See you next time. Thanks.